Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's installment of the Edison Research Lunchtime Webinar Series, Radio Listener Profiles, an Infinite Dial 2020 Report. We're going to get started, and I will now hand it over to Director of Research at Edison Research, Laura Ivy.
Thanks, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for spending a bit of time with us today for the next installment in our Lunchtime Webinar Series. I'm Laura Ivy, and I'm a Director of Research here at Edison Research. And my background, really my entire career, has been in the radio industry, so I'm very excited to be presenting data on radio listeners today. So before we get started, just a reminder, please use hashtag Infinite Dial if you're sharing any data on social media, and please feel free to do that. We'll be tweeting some of these slides during the webinar, but certainly share whatever you see. Also, if you have questions as we move along, just type them into the Q&A box and my colleagues at Edison Research will answer them during the presentation. If you are watching a replay of this webinar right now, you can just email your questions to info@edisonresearch.com. So the data you're going to be seeing today is from the Infinite Dial, which is an annual study we do with Triton Digital. It covers consumer usage of media and technology while also tracking new media as they develop. Overall findings from the telephone survey of the Infinite Dial were released in a webinar in March, but today's data comes from a supplemental online study, which was conducted at the same time. Now, that online component includes over 3,100 respondents. It was offered in English and Spanish, and it is weighted to the 12+ population figures from the US Census. Having an online survey like that allows us to ask the many questions outside of our more time-sensitive phone survey. And for this report, we're seeing responses among those who have listened to any AM/FM radio in the last week. Keep in mind that this survey was done before COVID-19 restrictions, which I know feels like many years ago to all of us. It was really just a few months ago. We aren't presenting any listening location data today, which is one behavior we know is affected by the pandemic. You can find research about audio behaviors during quarantine on our website. So let's get started. The formats we're looking at today are based on the format of the radio station that respondents said they listened to most often, otherwise known in radio lingo as first preference listeners, or P1. It's essentially your favorite station. So your P1 format is the radio format you listen to the most. And here when we say radio, we mean radio content or the product of radio. We aren't talking about the hardware. This could be over-the-air listening, or it could be listening to the radio station's streams. This also isn't a reach graph or time spent listening graph, because the station that one person listens to most often might only be 2 hours a week, but the station that another person listens to most often might be 10 hours a week. So the graph you're seeing is just based on those who said they listened to AM/FM radio in the last week, and these are the stations they listen to most often. Respondents could pick only one. So 13% of those who listened to AM/FM radio in the last week listened to hip hop rap most often. I just want to make sure we're clear on that as we look at the rest of the data. The top 11 formats are the ones we're going to focus on today. We included those with a healthy enough sample to make some observations about the data. So that's hip hop rap, country, classic rock, top 40, R&B, news talk, alternative rock, classic hits, contemporary Christian, sports, and hard rock heavy metal. If you're looking for AC on this graph, we just didn't have enough respondents choose soft rock to show the data. The challenge is describing an AC station in the survey, plus the fact that perhaps not enough people say it's the one they listen to most, unless prompted to think about at-work listening. So we didn't have enough AC listeners for analysis. In lieu of that traditional bar graph, I know you're looking forward to look at age and sex of format listeners, today we proudly present a quadrant. The x-axis, left to right, shows whether the audience comp of each format is likely to have more male listeners or more female listeners. This is going to be graphed on index. And then the y-axis, up and down, shows if the listeners are likely to be older or younger than the average age of a person in the US, which is 42 and a half. So one by one, let's see where these P1 formats appear in the quadrants. Hip hop rap, for example, is below the average age line, so younger, and to the left of the midline, so it's more likely to be male. We're going to see country float along the average age line, but lean female. There's classic rock, older, little male. Top 40 is younger and more likely to be female. R&B very near country on the midline. News talk leans older, more male. Alt rock is down there in the same quadrant with hip hop. Classic hits is the furthest up our age scale. Contemporary Christian is right on the average age line female. Hard rock occupies the same place on the age line as Christian, just on the other side it leans male. And then sports is younger than average and male. So if you look below that midline, you're going to see our younger formats: alt rock, hip hop rap, R&B, just barely, and then top 40. I like the way the data is visualized here because quadrants are good for showing the blank spaces, the places where there might be real estate to be claimed. Some of you have undoubtedly done the same exercise in your market to determine where a new format might fit. But you can see that these 11 formats cover most of the area, and you can also see what formats share the quadrant with your format. For ethnicity, the top bar on this graph shows the 12 plus ethnic makeup of the United States population overall. This is not related to listening, the top bar, but then the bars below it show the ethnic makeup of our 11 formats. So you can see which ones over index for each ethnicity. The first 8 formats, from country to sports, over index with white listeners. Sports is exactly market average for Black listeners, while hip hop, rap, R&B, and contemporary Christian over index for Black listeners. And then top 40 R&B and hip hop, rap over index for Hispanic Latino listeners. Let's take a look at the audio devices these P1 listeners own. This shows which P1 listeners are more likely to have an actual AM/FM radio receiver in their household. The black horizontal line shows the national average radio ownership of the 12 plus online population. So anything over 100 is more likely than average to have a radio in home. The 3 formats with the highest index for in-home radio are hard rock, heavy metal, news talk, and classic rock. The top 40 and hip hop rap P1 listeners index the lowest for an in-home radio. Now, this doesn't count in car radios. You know, a great deal of radio listening happens in car or perhaps at workplaces. This is just in your home. So a couple of points. Can you correlate the age of listeners with radio ownership? I mean, to some degree, yes. We see hip hop rap and top 40 who have some of the youngest listeners indexing the lowest for home radio ownership. But then again, country listeners are younger than classic hits listeners, but they index the same at 108 for owning a radio in home. So age doesn't perfectly correlate, but it's clear the formats that under index on the far right are the youngest. The second point is each year we report in the primary infinite dial survey, the numbers of radios have been declining each year and with each survey. But for every format here, and this is not a number you're going to see on this graph, but for every format, at least 58% of the listeners do have at least one radio in the household. So radio faces a hardware challenge, but we still have large majorities of people with radios in their homes. So the objective for radio is to convince more of those who don't have a radio to listen to radio content via streams. And one of the easiest ways to hear a radio stream is through your smart speaker. I'm a very proud AM/FM radio listener, but I will ask my smart speaker, who's going to remain nameless for this presentation, to play my favorite FM radio stations every day. And remember, these respondents listened to radio in the last week, so they're already regular consumers of audio. It shouldn't be a surprise that so many of them are likely to own smart speakers. Sports and top 40 P1 listeners index way over average for smart speaker ownership. Also over indexing for smart speakers is hard rock, heavy metal, R&B, alternative rock, and hip hop rap. Country listeners are slightly below the market average for smart speaker ownerships. We see our classic formats, classic rock, classic hits, as well as news talk and Christian indexing lower. Even the formats with the highest of ages still have significant numbers of smart speaker owners. Just again, this is not on the graph, but just so you'll know, a third of those who say news talk is their most listened to format owns a smart speaker. So even then, it's just below the market average, but they're still out there. So now let's take a look at how much audio each format P1 listens to through headphones or earbuds. That's the amount of personal listening they do. Almost all hip hop rap listeners, 93%, listen to some audio through headphones or earbuds, followed by R&B at 86% and sports at 83%. The formats with fewer P1 listeners listening are classic rock, news talk, and contemporary Christian. The outlier is that classic hits at the bottom of our graph with only 34% listening to some audio through their headphones or earbuds. You look at this graph and you think, is any of this problematic for radio? And that's only to the degree that earbuds or headphones are generally connected to computers or mobile devices and not to radio receivers, which should be even more motivation to convert your listeners to streams. So now we're going to look at social media and the social media behaviors of our P1 listeners. Social media, love it or hate it, it's where you can reach your listeners and brand your audio outlets. What you see here is a logo for each of our social media brands, and then under each brand, a list of the formats that are more likely than average to use that brand. So left to right, the social media brands are listed in order of overall size. So we have Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, WhatsApp, Pinterest, TikTok, and LinkedIn. Now, the first thing you should notice is that we are analyzing 11 formats overall, but there are only 3 to 6 formats or 4 to 6 formats listed under each brand. Not every format over-indexes for every brand, so look for your formats. The next thing to notice is that top 40 over-indexes for every brand, from Facebook to LinkedIn. Top 40 listeners love all social media. If you take a look at Pinterest, we've got more female-leaning formats over-indexing for Pinterest. Hip hop rap is another format that does well across all brands or most brands. And this is just a way to see where your listeners to your format are more likely to be and where your potential listeners are likely to be. So where can you find those people? We know there's a lot of information on this graph. We will be posting the slides. This is a good time to mention this. We will be posting the slides online after the webinar, but some real clues exist to where you might more efficiently find and market to and connect with your station's listeners. Now, the previous graphic showed us which formats over-index for each brand, and it showed the breadth of social media out there. This graph shows us what percentage of P1 listeners to each format use these social media brands most often. For all the talk of how Facebook usage has fallen and then regained some ground, and it has, and we have authored many of those studies, you can see that Facebook is still the social media brand used most often for the biggest percentage of every format on this graph, even younger leaning formats. When you look at some of these younger formats, though, you're going to see the pink bars with Instagram pop up, and then Snapchat with the yellow bars. Twitter is represented in blue. It's worth noting the bottom bar for our sports listeners, 18% of sports listeners use Twitter most often. So beyond marketing your station and trying to find your listeners or recruit new listeners, another reason we want to look at social media is because that is a space where people can share music suggestions. And they do. We've looked at music sharing in a few different studies. The country radio seminar last year, we found that teens share music suggestions through social media with their country music listening parents. If you caught our webinar at the end of July on new music seekers, we know that more than half of new music seekers use social media to share updates on the music they're listening to with friends and family. So topping our graph here are hip hop rap out in front with 41% that share music updates through social media, followed by R&B and then alternative rock and Christian. Maybe hip hop rap's propensity to share via social media speaks to passion about the music, love of the music, just overall interest and enthusiasm about the music. So let's take a look at online audio listening among our format P1 listeners. This represents any online audio listening done in the past week by the P1 listeners to these formats. Now, it's not just listening to these formats or just to radio. This is any online listening we're seeing here. At the top of this graph, you can see that 5 P1 radio formats have at least 75% of their listeners who have listened to online audio in the last week. That's sports, top 40, alt rock, hard rock, heavy metal, and hip hop rap. Near the bottom of the list are our more mature formats, classic hits, news talk, and classic rock. If you note, though, that bottom bar, 39% of those classic hits P1 listeners are weekly online audio listeners. So even though they have the smallest number in the graph, their online audio consumption is still significant. The point is, Your listeners who mostly listen to your over-the-air signals are also listening to online audio. Which begs the question, have any of these P1 listeners listened to an AM/FM radio station online in the past week? So we just saw that for many formats, 75% of their listeners were weekly online audio listeners. So it's a little worrisome that we see such low percentages of those listeners who have ever listened to an AM/FM radio station online. And this is not asking if they're listening to that particular format. It's just, have they listened to any AM/FM radio station online? And we know these are internet savvy respondents because they're taking an online survey. Sports has the highest number of people who've listened to an AM/FM radio station online in the last week. Classic Hits has the fewest. We did release a data point at the end of last year from our Share of Ear study, and then again after the COVID-19 restrictions went into place, and our findings have remained consistent. It just shows that the vast majority of time spent with AM/FM radio is spent listening over the air, not listening to the stream. Around 90% of listening to AM/FM radio is done via the over-the-air signal, not to the stream. So we asked respondents in the survey, how important is it that you hear no commercials or fewer commercials when you're listening to online audio? And the formats at the top of our graph have higher numbers of P1 listeners who say fewer or no commercials is the only reason. If you look across the top, green is the percentage who say it's not a reason for listening to online audio. Blue in the middle, commercials, it's an important reason, but it's not the only reason. And then to the right, the orange bars represent commercials are the only reason, or few or no commercials are the only reason for listening to online audio. So the takeaway here is that for many, it's a reason, and it's a significant reason, but it's not the only reason. We have to think about the other things that online audio offers to appeal to listeners besides just reduced commercials. So should we be focused on pruning commercial load? Of course, and increasing the quality of commercials that we put in at the commercial breaks. We also have to think about the other things that are appealing about online audio, including portability, curated playlists, etc. And we know radio has plenty to offer with the appeal of personalities and with locally targeted information. So we know they're listening online. Which audio brands do they prefer? Now we get to the specific brands. Do certain formats prefer certain online audio brands? Because our survey was an online survey, we would expect to see some substantial online behaviors from this group. Here you're going to see the social media brands. Below each one is a list of formats in order that over-index for using that brand in the last month. So left to right, it's Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, iHeart, Google Play, Apple Music, and then on the far right is SoundCloud. And those formats below the logos, they're ranked in order by index. So the first format under each of the social media platforms ranks the highest for using that platform. So just like we saw top 40 over-indexing for all social media brands, they also over-index for many online audio brands. And if you're missing something on this chart, it's that Classic Hits doesn't appear on here at all. Country, interestingly, over-indexes for Pandora, but not Spotify. And then SoundCloud has the most narrow appeal, over-indexing for hip-hop, rap, R&B, and sports. Now, the previous graph, so we also have news talk as well. So the previous graph showed where the social media brands that stations over-index for. This one shows the audio brand that stations and P1 listeners use most often. The blue bar is Pandora, that's off to the left. We see a different set of formats here pop to the top. You see R&B, country, classic rock, alt rock, classic hits, almost with the same numbers to the left. The Pandora service functions almost like a hybrid of traditional radio listening and other online services. It's most like AM/FM radio, so you can see how popular it is with these formats. When we look at this ranked by Pandora, iHeart also shows great usage with these formats, and of course, Spotify, a favorite in the second bars. And keep in mind, this is not just listening to radio, this is overall listening on these brands. And so this could be podcasts or any number of audio options. Here are the rest of the formats we're going to look at. Continuing to be ranked by Pandora on the left, you can see where we also have iHeart in purple. I'm sorry, iHeart in the red, Apple Music in purple. You can see where Contemporary Christian does very well with Apple Music, and then Amazon Music with News Talk, Top 40, and Sports. Keep in mind that some of these brands we're seeing on here also offer the hardware that goes along with their music service. Now, any argument that YouTube should not be included in the audio universe because it's only a video service, that argument is long dead. YouTube is a source of music consumption for many listeners. The formats who have the most P1 listeners using YouTube weekly for music are R&B, hip hop, hard rock, heavy metal, and top 40. And consistently, with the least usage at the bottom of this graph is classic hits. Although I'm just going to say, speaking anecdotally, my 75-year-old father was talking about how much he loves YouTube for music because, as he says, once you listen to something, it makes suggestions of other things you might also like. So it is maybe surprising to you to see these numbers so high for so many of these formats. But we have many P1 radio listeners who are using YouTube for weekly usage of music. So how many of our P1 listeners also have Sirius subscriptions, Sirius XM subscriptions? Hard rock, heavy metal tops this list at 39%, followed by R&B, news talk, and alt rock. Formats with more specialized content, of course, they're likely to be Sirius XM subscribers because Sirius does that very well. What you're seeing here is just subscription to Sirius XM. It doesn't necessarily mean they're listening to their P1 format on Sirius. And we know the pandemic has changed our commuting habits. It will be interesting to see during the next go around of Infinite Dial how these numbers on this graph change, since we know the majority of Sirius XM listening is done in car. So music discovery, where do listeners to various formats discover their new music? Now, before we learn where they discover it, let's figure out how important new music is to each format. The green bars on the left show that music discovery is very important to the P1 listeners of each format, and then orange is somewhat important. Blue is the percentage of listeners that said it's not important at all. Back to our love of music, hip hop, rap, alt rock, R&B, top 40, all said that they had the most listeners that say it's very important or somewhat important to stay up to date with new music. Our classic hits and classic rock, which don't feature new music, will show the least interest in new tunes. And again, this was brought out in our webinar at the end of July. New music is not the same thing as hits. So if you look at that country bar and see that 40% say that music, learning about and staying up to date with new music is not important at all, they still want the hits. And we know that radio delivers the hits. So what are the top sources for each music discovery source for each format? I know there's a lot on this graph, but just stay with us. We'll try to make it easy to see. This table shows the top 3 sources in rank order for each of the formats across the top. And we're just looking at the music formats here. We're not looking at sports or news talk in this graph. So let's look at how many use AM FM. These respondents are people, they're already listening to AM FM radio. We know that, but we see AM FM radio as being used for music discovery. It makes an appearance in several places. It's the source that most country listeners use for music discovery, and also classic rock, top 40, classic hits, Christian, and hard rock heavy metal. Now, YouTube is one of the top 3 sources for every format for music discovery. It is the source that most hip hop rap listeners use, R&B listeners, and alt rock listeners. Now, regardless of the average age of listeners to these formats, right? Look across the top and see the range. YouTube is in the top 3 for music discovery for every format on this chart. Also appearing in the top 3 is family and friends. We all depend on our family and friends to pass along their latest finds in new music. And they could either tell you about new music by actually speaking to you. I know we're not gathering, so you're not getting that information at parties and large gatherings like we once did. They could also share that with you through social media, as we mentioned earlier. But family and friends for every single format is a large source of music discovery. Excuse me. Now, the last graph we're going to see about music discovery is which source people use most often. So before was sources they use. This is what do they use most often. And we see the yellow bars on the left. It's ranked by AM, FM. And then we can see that YouTube is with orange, and then green is family and friends, like we saw on the table. So this is ranked in order of AM, FM. We can see classic hits, country, top 40 at the top of this list for using AM, FM radio most often. If you look at the orange bars, just look at the bottom of the graph and you'll see our youngest format or younger format, hip hop rap, at the bottom of this graph. Now, on to podcasting. So the yellow bars show us the percentage of P1 listeners to each format who have ever listened to a podcast. This is any podcast. Now, here are weekly radio listeners. They're taking a survey online, so we know that they're consumers of audio and they're comfortable with technology. So the numbers here are substantial. Alt rock, hard rock, hip hop rap, they have the most P1 listeners who have ever listened to a podcast. At the bottom, we've got classic hits with 38%. Now, besides just having ever listened to a podcast, let's talk about weekly podcast listeners. Over half of the alternative rock listeners are weekly podcast listeners with sports, top 40, and hip hop rap behind them. What you may wonder looking at this graph is what types of podcasts would listeners to my formats be listening to? And we have that information for you. So the table here shows the formats across the top of the table, and then in descending order, the topics that the listeners are most interested in hearing on podcasts. We know that there are millions of podcast episodes floating around out there, but these are the most popular topics. Music is a topic that is in many places on our table, with the exception of classic rock, news talk, contemporary Christian, and sports. For 3 of the formats on our table, it is the number 1 topic for podcasts: hip hop rap, alternative rock, and hard rock heavy metal. Next, we're going to see news info. It shows up in 6 formats as a top subject: classic rock, top 40. I don't know if you were expecting that or not. Top 40, R&B, news talk, so that tracks, right? Classic hits, and then hard rock. Not surprisingly, history is the top pick for the formats with the word classic in the title. Also appears in the top 3 for contemporary Christian and sports. And then you might feel like true crime is the number 1 podcasting topic for every person in the universe because we hear so much about the genre. But you can see it only shows up for country, for R&B, and for alternative rock. So there's a lot to digest on this slide as well. And we will be posting this as part of the deck online at edisonresearch.com at the conclusion of the webinar. So what are some of our observations from today? Number 1, radio continues to have a hardware challenge. At this point echoes a presentation that my colleague Meg Lazovic gave at the 2018 RAIN Summit. Radio has an ever-growing hardware challenge because increasingly people, they don't have standard radios in their homes. This is especially true for P1 listeners to younger delivering formats. So for all radio and all formats, the goal should be to move your brands and your fans to listening on phones or other digital devices. Next, smart speakers provide part of the answer. A sizable number of P1s to each format, as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, are smart speaker owners. And we know that listening to radio station streams is one of the top use cases for smart speaker owners. Our data implies that formats with unique content like sports talk have more smart speaker owners. And competing on that infinite dial is much easier when you have some differentiated content. As far as social media, Facebook still rules social media. Fans of every format said this is the social media platform they use most. And for older targeted formats, it's not even close. For younger leaning formats, Facebook still leads, but it's from a slightly weaker position. So make sure you look at the favorite services. You can go back to the tables in this presentation and see where you can find your listeners. For interest, for example, you can use Pinterest if your station is more female targeting, LinkedIn or Twitter for men. The idea of showing up in unexpected, targeted places might help your station find new listeners or remind lapsed listeners to tune in. Anecdotally, also, I do have to share, I was at a radio convention, and there was a Q&A afterwards, and one of the young people stood up, and her question, she said, I'm a 22-year-old student. How would I find out about radio? And that really struck me as the parent of older teenage children. How do my kids and how do younger generations growing up find out about radio? So hopefully we've given you some places to find those people and talk to them in the data you've seen today. We know that online AM/FM radio listening remains elusive. Edison Research started the Infinite Dial in 1998, and that was 22 years ago. And that time we've seen that listening increasingly coming from internet sources, outpacing radio's growth on phones and computers and now smart speakers. So we're looking for radio to provide its products blended with some of the advantages of those online services. And until then, linear streams that maybe aren't highly differentiated products might struggle in the digital realm. And then finally, music discovery, it's moving to YouTube and to other places. I'll echo another presentation that Edison Research gave previously, the one on music discovery by Nicole Beniamini. And increasingly, AM/FM is just not the place where people go to learn about new music. Between the ads, between the advent of streaming, especially YouTube, it's just not the place you go for the latest releases. But radio maintains its stronghold. It is still the place where you learn where the hits are. And as we've seen, there is still music discovery happening at AM/FM radio. So we understand some of the challenges. Hopefully this analysis moves us down the road a bit further in understanding which devices our P1 listeners use, which streaming services they use, how we can more easily find them and connect with them through social media, because we know radio has such a valuable product to deliver. So thank you for your time today. Special thanks to our partners at Triton Digital for helping bring this invaluable knowledge to the media and research communities. Thanks to everyone on the research team at Edison Research who works to make these webinars happen. These slides, as well as a recording of this presentation, will be posted on edisonresearch.com shortly after the webinar. You will be hearing from us in October with a spoken word audio report from Edison Research and NPR with Megan Lazovic, as well as plenty on podcasting from Tom Webster. So look for us at Podcast Movement and follow us on social media for details. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.